They told him the helicopter was dead. 17 mechanics, 3 crew chiefs, and a full team of Sikorsky-trained avionics specialists had spent 9 straight hours staring at a Blackhawk that refused to breathe. The rotors were still. The turbines were cold. The cockpit instruments stared back at them like the eyes of a corpse. And somewhere out in the mountains of western North Carolina, a family of 4 was trapped in rising floodwater with the clock running out. The base commander picked up a secure phone, dialed a number he hadn't used in 6 years, and said 5 words that changed everything. "Frank, I need you now." The man on the other end of the line was 78 years old. He hadn't set foot on a military installation in over a decade. He had arthritis in both hands, a torn rotator cuff he never got fixed, and a 17-year-old pickup truck with 200,000 miles on it, and he said one word back, "Coming." 3 hours later, that Blackhawk was in the air. If that doesn't earn your respect, nothing will. Comment the word legend right now if you believe some things can never be taught in a classroom. This is the story of Frank Castellano, and it is one you will never forget. Frank Castellano was not the kind of man who stood out in a crowd. He stood 5'8" on a good day, maybe 160 pounds if he'd just eaten. His hair had gone white sometime in his late 50s, and by 78 it was thin enough that he'd taken to wearing the same faded olive-drab ball cap every day of his life. The cap had no unit insignia on it, no flashy patches, no bumper sticker slogans about freedom or service. Just a small, almost invisible embroidered outline of a helicopter on the left side, stitched in black thread so dark you'd miss it unless you were looking. He lived alone in a small clapboard house outside Weaverville, North Carolina, about 15 miles north of Asheville, up in the folds of the Blue Ridge, where the mornings came cold even in September, and the fog hung in the hollows until almost noon. The house wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen with a wood stove he used more than the electric range because he said food tasted better when you cooked it slow. The garage out back was another matter entirely. It was twice the size of the house, and if you looked inside you'd think you'd walked into some kind of museum that couldn't decide if it was dedicated to aviation or mechanical engineering. Workbenches ran the entire length of both walls, covered in tools that range from surgical precision torque wrenches to welding rigs he'd built himself from scrap. Hanging from the ceiling on hooks were engine components, rotor assemblies, hydraulic manifolds, all cleaned and catalogued like artifacts in a Smithsonian archive. Frank had spent 41 years working on helicopters for the United States Army. Not flying them, though he could have. Not commanding them, though more than a few officers had told him he should have gone to OCS, fixing them, keeping them alive, making dead machines fly again when everyone else had given up and signed the paperwork to send them to the boneyard. He'd started as a young enlisted mechanic at Fort Rucker in Alabama in 1966, back when the Army was burning through helicopters in Vietnam faster than Bell and Sikorsky could build them. He'd cut his teeth on Hueys, learned their electrical systems the way a surgeon learns the nervous system, by touch and instinct and thousands of hours of practice until the machine became an extension of his own body. By the time the UH-60 Blackhawk entered service in 1979, Frank was already considered one of the most gifted rotary wing mechanics in the entire Army. He didn't just fix what was broken, he understood why it broke. He could listen to a turbine spool up and tell you which bearing was wearing thin before any diagnostic equipment caught it. He could put his hand on a transmission housing and feel a vibration that was 0.003 inches out of spec. The younger mechanics called it magic. Frank called it paying attention. He'd retired in 2007 with the rank of Chief Warrant Officer 4, a rank that in Army aviation maintenance circles carried a weight roughly equivalent to a 4-star general, telling you to sit down and listen. He'd served in Vietnam, Grenada, Panama, the First Gulf War, Somalia, Bosnia, and both Iraq and Afghanistan. Every single one of those deployments had put him shoulder deep inside helicopter engines, while other people were shooting at the aircraft he was trying to keep flyable. He had a Bronze Star, 2 Meritorious Service Medals, and an Army Commendation Medal with a V device for valor that he kept in a coffee can on his workbench, because the shadow box his wife had made for him before she passed had fallen off the wall during a storm and he never got around to hanging it back up. Frank didn't talk about his service much. The neighbours in Weaverville knew he was retired military, and a few of them knew he'd worked on helicopters, but that was about the extent of it. He went to the hardware store on Tuesdays, the grocery store on Thursdays, had breakfast at a diner called Patsy's on Saturday mornings, where he ordered the same thing every week: 2 eggs over easy, rye toast, black coffee, and he left a $5 tip on a $7 check because the waitress was a single mother. And Frank believed in taking care of people who worked hard. He didn't go to the VFW, he didn't march in parades, he didn't put veteran bumper stickers on his truck. When people asked him what he did before he retired, he usually said something like, "I worked on engines." That was it. No elaboration, no stories, no glory. Just a quiet old man in a quiet mountain town, living out his days with his tools and his memories and the faint smell of turbine oil that never quite washed out of his hands no matter how much soap he used. The crisis began on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, the kind of day that starts out looking like nothing special and ends up in the history books. Hurricane Mara had been downgraded to a tropical storm by the time it crossed into the Appalachian foothills, but the meteorologists had badly underestimated the amount of moisture it was dragging inland. By 2 in the afternoon, the creeks and rivers in Buncombe County were rising at a rate that hadn't been seen since 1916. By 4, entire sections of road were underwater. By 6, the emergency calls started coming in faster than the dispatchers could log them. One of those calls came from a man named David Peralta, a 36-year-old schoolteacher who had been driving his wife and 2 young daughters home from a visit to his mother-in-law's house, when the bridge on Old Leicester Highway washed out behind them and the road ahead disappeared under 4 feet of muddy churning water. They were stranded on a section of elevated road about 200 yards long, surrounded on all sides by floodwater that was rising by the minute. The car was a small sedan, and the water was already lapping at the bottom of the doors. David had his wife and 2 girls, ages 4 and 7, standing on the roof of the car. He was calling 911, and the dispatcher could hear the panic in his voice even through the static of a failing cell signal. They had maybe an hour, maybe less, before the water reached the road surface and there would be nowhere left to stand. The call was relayed to the North Carolina Army National Guard Aviation Unit, based out of a facility near Asheville Regional Airport. They had a UH-60 Blackhawk on standby for exactly this kind of situation, a search and rescue bird equipped with a hoist, basket and full emergency medical kit. The crew was ready. The pilots were suited up. The rescue swimmers had their gear on. Everything was go. Everything except the helicopter. The crew chief, a staff sergeant named Rivera, had run the pre-flight checklist and found the problem at step 14. The number 2 engine wouldn't start. Not a slow start, not a rough start. Nothing. Dead. No ignition, no spool, no response from the starter generator, nothing on the gauges. The engine was as inert as a piece of furniture. They tried the standard troubleshooting. They checked the battery bus. They checked the starter relay. They checked the ignition exciter. They swapped the electronic control unit with a spare. Nothing. They pulled the cowling and did a visual inspection. Nothing out of place. Nothing obviously damaged. No blown lines. No disconnected harnesses. The engine looked perfect. It just wouldn't start. Rivera called in the maintenance officer, a captain named Walsh, who had been working on Blackhawks for 8 years. Walsh ran his own diagnostics, pulled up the technical manuals, consulted the fault isolation procedures, and came up empty. He called the battalion maintenance officer, a major who drove over from another facility and spent 2 hours going through the same procedures with the same result. They brought in a civilian contractor from Sikorsky, who happened to be in the area doing a scheduled inspection on another airframe. He couldn't figure it out either. The contractor made a phone call to the Sikorsky Engineering Support Hotline in Connecticut. The engineers on the other end walked them through a diagnostic tree that took another hour, still nothing. By now it was past midnight. The floodwater was still rising. David Peralta and his family had been rescued by a swift water team in an inflatable boat, but there were at least 14 other emergency calls pending, several of them in areas that could only be reached by air. People were on rooftops and trees, clinging to anything they could find above the waterline, and the Blackhawk sat on the tarmac like a monument to frustration, surrounded by toolboxes and diagnostic equipment, and a small army of mechanics who had collectively hundreds of years of experience, and not one of them could make the machine do the one thing it was built to do. Captain Walsh stood in the rain staring at the helicopter and said what everyone else was thinking. "We're out of ideas." The base commander, a colonel named Patricia Engel, had been monitoring the situation from the operations center. Colonel Engel was not a woman who accepted the words "out of ideas" gracefully. She was 52 years old, had commanded a medical evacuation company in Afghanistan, and had a reputation for solving problems that other people said couldn't be solved. She walked out onto the flight line at 12:30 in the morning, rain hammering her field jacket, and looked at the silent Blackhawk for a long moment. Then she turned to Walsh and said, "Who is the single best Blackhawk mechanic you have ever seen or heard of in your entire career?" Walsh didn't hesitate. "Frank Castellano. But ma'am, he's been retired for almost 20 years. He's got to be pushing 80. Engel looked at him. "Is he alive?" Walsh nodded. "Last I heard, yeah. Lives up in the mountains somewhere." Engel said, "Get me his number." It took 15 minutes to track down Frank Castellano's phone number through a chain of calls that went from the battalion personnel office to a retired sergeant major in Fayetteville, who still had Frank's number in his phone. At 12:45 in the morning, Frank's phone rang in his kitchen in Weaverville. He was still awake. He was always awake at that hour. Sleep had become a sometime visitor in his old age, and he'd learned to make peace with the quiet hours between midnight and 4 by reading or cleaning tools, or just sitting on his back porch listening to the rain on the metal roof of his garage. He picked up the phone on the second ring. The voice on the other end identified herself as Colonel Patricia Engel, commander of the Aviation Support Facility. Frank listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't ask questions. He just listened as the colonel explained the situation. The flood, the stranded civilians, the Black Hawk that wouldn't start, the 17 mechanics who couldn't find the problem, and the people who were going to die if that helicopter didn't fly. When she finished, there was a pause. Then Frank said, "What model engine?" Engel said, T700GE701D. Another pause. "When was the last phase maintenance?" Engel relayed the question to Walsh, who checked the logbook. 14 months ago. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll be there in 3 hours. Don't let anyone touch that engine again until I get there." Engel started to thank him, but the line was already dead. Frank moved through his house with a deliberateness that belied his age. He didn't rush, but he didn't waste a single motion. He put on a pair of worn Carhartt work pants, a flannel shirt, and his old army field jacket, the one with his name tape still sewn above the right breast pocket. He went to the garage and opened a steel footlocker that sat against the far wall. Inside were tools. Not ordinary tools, though there were plenty of those on his workbenches. These were specific tools, a curated set that he had assembled over 4 decades of working on the T700 engine family. Wrenches ground down to fit into spaces the original manufacturers hadn't anticipated. Inspection mirrors with custom bent handles. A stethoscope, an actual medical stethoscope, that he used to listen to engine components the way a cardiologist listens to a heart. A set of feeler gauges so precise they could measure clearances thinner than a human hair. And at the bottom of the footlocker, wrapped in an oilcloth, a small notebook. The notebook was the size of a paperback novel, with a brown leather cover that had gone soft and dark with years of handling. Inside were handwritten notes, diagrams, observations, and procedures that Frank had compiled over 41 years of working on helicopter engines. Things that weren't in any technical manual. Things he'd learned the hard way, in hangars and flight lines and forward operating bases from the Mekong Delta to the Korangal Valley. Things that no classroom, no simulator, and no computer diagnostic system could ever teach you, because they could only be learned by putting your hands on the machine and listening to what it was trying to tell you. He put the footlocker in the bed of his truck, climbed behind the wheel, and pulled out of his driveway at 1:15 in the morning. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the mountain roads between Weaverville and Asheville were slick and winding in the dark. Frank drove carefully but steadily, the way he did everything, his headlights cutting through the downpour, his wipers slapping a rhythm against the windshield, his hands steady on the wheel. He arrived at the aviation facility at 4:10 in the morning. The gate guard looked at the old man in the beat-up pickup truck and almost turned him away until Frank held up his retired military ID and said, "Colonel Engel is expecting me." The guard made a phone call, his eyebrows went up, and he waved Frank through. The flight line was lit up like a stadium. Portable floodlights surrounded the Blackhawk, and despite Frank's instruction, the area was still crawling with mechanics, contractors, and officers who had come out to see if there was any progress. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle. Frank parked his truck about 50 yards from the helicopter, got out slowly, and pulled his footlocker from the truck bed. He carried it in both arms across the wet tarmac, his boots splashing through puddles, the footlocker heavy but manageable because Frank had carried heavier things across worse terrain in places where people were trying to kill him. Captain Walsh was the first to approach. He looked at Frank and saw an old man in a worn field jacket carrying a metal box. Walsh had expected someone more imposing, more official, more something. "Mr. Castellano," he said, using the civilian address. Frank set the footlocker down next to the helicopter and looked at Walsh. "Chief Castellano," he corrected, quietly but firmly. "Who's been working on her?" Walsh introduced himself and gave Frank the rundown. Every diagnostic they'd tried, every component they'd swapped, every procedure they'd followed. Frank listened to the entire briefing without saying a word. When Walsh finished, Frank nodded once and said, "Everyone step back from the aircraft." There was a moment of awkward silence. Some of the younger mechanics exchanged glances. A couple of them smirked. Walsh looked uncertain. Rivera, the crew chief, crossed his arms. These were trained professionals, certified and current on the UH-60 platform, and they were being told to step aside by a man old enough to be their grandfather. Colonel Engel, who had been watching from just outside the circle of floodlights, stepped forward. "You heard him," she said. "Clear the aircraft." They moved. Frank opened his footlocker and took out his stethoscope. He put the earpieces in and pressed the chest piece against the skin of the engine cowling, moving it slowly, methodically, inch by inch, the way a doctor examines a patient. He closed his eyes. He listened. The mechanics watched him, and some of them tried not to look skeptical. A 78-year-old man pressing a medical stethoscope against a military helicopter engine in the rain at 4 a.m. It looked like something out of a movie, and not the kind of movie that had a happy ending. Frank moved the stethoscope to a different position, then another, then another. After about 5 minutes, he opened his eyes and removed the earpieces. He reached into the footlocker and took out a small inspection mirror with a telescoping handle and a penlight. He slid underneath the engine in a cell, his old body moving with surprising ease into a space that most of the younger mechanics would have found tight. He was under there for 10 minutes. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were the drip of rain off the rotor blades and the occasional distant wail of a siren somewhere in the flooded darkness beyond the airfield perimeter. When Frank slid back out, his jacket was smeared with grime and his knees were wet, but his expression was calm, almost serene. He stood up, brushed off his pants, and looked at Walsh. "You've got a partially seized fuel control unit," he said. "Not the ECU, the hydromechanical unit upstream of it, the one that meters fuel to the combustion chamber. There's a microparticle contamination in the metering valve, probably from the last fuel filter change. Someone didn't purge the line properly, and over time a particulate worked its way into the valve seat. It's not enough to throw a fault code because the valve isn't fully seized, it's just stuck enough to prevent the fuel flow needed for ignition. Your diagnostics didn't catch it because the system reads the valve position as nominal. It's within spec on paper, but it's not moving." Walsh stared at him. "How could you possibly know that from a stethoscope?" Frank looked at him with an expression that was neither arrogant nor condescending, just patient, the way a man looks when he's explained something 1,000 times, and has long since stopped being frustrated by the question. "When you try to start this engine, the starter generator spins the compressor section. If everything is working, fuel gets metered into the combustion chamber and the igniter fires. When I listened to the start sequence earlier while your boys ran it for me on the way in, I could hear the compressor spinning up normally. Igniter was firing. But there was no combustion. That means no fuel in the chamber, or not enough. The fuel pump is working, I could hear it. The shut-off valve is open, I checked. That leaves the fuel control unit. And when I put the scope on the HMU housing, I could feel the valve trying to actuate but not completing its travel. It's a vibration pattern I've felt exactly twice before. Once in Mogadishu in '93, once in Bagram in 2004. Same engine family, same failure mode, same cause, microparticle contamination in the metering valve. He reached into his footlocker and pulled out a small custom-made tool that looked like a cross between a dental pick and a miniature socket wrench. "I need someone to hold a light for me. This will take about 10 minutes. Rivera stepped forward. Something in Frank's voice, in his certainty, in the specific way he had described the failure mode with the precision of a man reciting his own name, had turned the crew chief from a skeptic into a believer. Rivera held the penlight while Frank worked. The old man's hands were thick-knuckled and scarred, the hands of someone who had spent a lifetime reaching into spaces that were too hot, too tight, and too dangerous for most people. But they were steady. Remarkably, almost impossibly steady for a man his age. He worked on the fuel control unit with the focus of a jeweler, his movements small and precise and deliberate. He didn't speak while he worked, neither did anyone else. The only sounds were the click and scrape of metal on metal, the drip of rain, and Frank's slow, steady breathing. Exactly 8 minutes later, Frank pulled his hands out of the engine compartment and stepped back. In his left hand, held between his thumb and forefinger, was a piece of metallic debris smaller than a grain of rice. He held it up so Walsh could see it. "There's your gremlin," he said. Walsh looked at the particle, then at Frank, then back at the particle. That tiny thing shut down a Blackhawk? Frank closed the cowling and wiped his hands on a rag from his footlocker. That tiny thing was going to let people drown tonight. He turned to Rivera. "Button her up. Run the start sequence." Rivera didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled up to the cockpit while the ground crew cleared the area. The pilot, a chief warrant officer named Gutierrez who had been sitting in the ready room for the past 7 hours drinking bad coffee and staring at weather maps, came running when someone radioed that the aircraft might be mission ready. He strapped in, ran through the abbreviated checklist with Rivera, and initiated the start sequence. The number 2 engine lit off on the first try. The sound of the turbine spooling up cut through the pre-dawn darkness like a trumpet call, rising from a whisper to a whine to a full-throated roar that vibrated through the tarmac and into the chest of every person standing on that flight line. It was a sound that meant life. It meant rescue. It meant that people who had spent the night clinging to rooftops and car hoods and tree branches were going to see dawn after all. Rivera's voice came over the radio, steady and professional, but with an unmistakable edge of emotion. "Number 2 is nominal. All systems green. Aircraft is mission ready." A cheer went up from the flight line. Someone clapped. Someone else let out a shout that was half relief and half disbelief. But Frank didn't react to any of it. He was standing next to his footlocker, calmly repacking his tools, his face betraying nothing except perhaps a quiet satisfaction. The kind that comes not from applause but from knowing that the job was done right. Colonel Engel walked over to him. She had to raise her voice over the increasing roar of the engines as Gutierrez ran up the rotors for the emergency launch. "Chief Castellano," she said, and the way she said it, with the emphasis on his rank, was itself a statement. "How can I possibly thank you?" Frank closed his footlocker and picked it up. "You can get that bird in the air, Colonel. People are waiting." Engel looked at him for a long moment. Then she saluted him. A full colonel, in the rain, on an active flight line, rendering a salute to a retired chief warrant officer in a dirty field jacket. Frank set down the footlocker, straightened his back, and returned the salute with a crispness that 50 years of service had burned into his muscle memory so deeply that age and arthritis could never take it away. The Blackhawk lifted off at 4:32 in the morning. Within the first hour, it pulled 3 people off a rooftop in Leicester, hoisted a pregnant woman out of a flooded mobile home near Candler, and recovered an elderly couple who had been stranded in their car on a washed-out bridge for 9 hours. By the time the sun came up, the crew had completed 6 rescue missions and brought 14 people to safety. 14 lives, every one of them connected to that tiny particle of debris that had lodged in a fuel metering valve, and to the 78-year-old man who was the only person in the entire chain of command who could find it. Frank didn't stay to watch the helicopter take off. He didn't stay for the debriefing, the paperwork, or the congratulations. He carried his footlocker back to his truck, set it in the bed, and drove home through the thinning rain, as dawn turned the mountains from black to grey to the deep green of late September. He got home a little after 7, made himself a pot of coffee, fried 2 eggs, and sat down at his kitchen table with the kind of silence that only a man who's done something meaningful and expects nothing in return can truly inhabit. But the story didn't end there. Captain Walsh couldn't stop thinking about what he had witnessed. In his 8 years of working on Blackhawks, he had never seen anyone diagnose a fault that precisely, that quickly, using tools that most modern mechanics would consider obsolete. He started asking around about Frank Castellano, making phone calls, pulling records, talking to retired aviation maintenance personnel who remembered the name. What he found was staggering. Frank Castellano had been involved in the maintenance and repair of over 600 individual helicopter airframes during his career. He held the Army record for the most field-expedient engine repairs in a combat zone, a record that had stood since the Gulf War and would almost certainly never be broken, because the conditions that created it, a single maintenance warrant officer keeping an entire company's worth of Blackhawks flying during a 100-hour ground war with limited parts and no depot support, were unlikely to ever be replicated. He had been personally credited with saving the lives of 11 aircrew members by identifying and correcting critical faults that other mechanics had missed. He had written or contributed to 14 technical bulletins that were incorporated into the official UH-60 maintenance procedures and were still in use. He had trained over 200 aviation mechanics during his career, many of whom had gone on to become maintenance officers and senior warrant officers themselves, and he had turned down a direct commission to the rank of major not once but twice, because he said he didn't want to stop working on engines to go sit behind a desk. Walsh brought everything he'd learned to Colonel Engel. Engel brought it to her commanding general. The general made a phone call to Washington. Within a week, a letter arrived at Frank's house in Weaverville on Department of the Army letterhead. It thanked him for his service on the night of the flood and informed him that he was being nominated for the Meritorious Civilian Service Award, the highest award the Army can give to a civilian, for his role in enabling the rescue of 14 people. Frank read the letter, folded it carefully, and put it in the same coffee can as his other medals. He didn't call anyone about it. He didn't mention it at Patsy's Diner on Saturday morning. When the waitress asked him how his week had been, he said, "Quiet, you know how it goes." But Walsh wasn't finished. He had seen something that night that went beyond a single repair on a single helicopter. He had seen the gap between what modern military training produced and what decades of hands-on experience could achieve, and it troubled him. He wrote a detailed report about the incident and submitted it through his chain of command with a recommendation that the Army establish a formal mentorship program pairing retired aviation maintenance veterans with active duty units. The report made its way up through several layers of bureaucracy, was nearly lost twice, was championed by Colonel Engel, who refused to let it die, and eventually landed on the desk of a brigadier general in the Army Aviation Centre of Excellence at Fort Novosil who happened to be a former Blackhawk pilot. The general read the report, read about Frank Castellano, and said, "Why aren't we already doing this?" 6 months later, the Army announced a pilot program called the Legacy Maintenance Initiative, a program that brought retired aviation maintenance veterans back onto military installations as paid consultants and mentors. They weren't there to replace anyone. They were there to teach the things that couldn't be put into a PowerPoint presentation or a technical manual. How to listen to an engine, how to feel a vibration that doesn't show up on a sensor, how to think about a machine not as a collection of parts and systems, but as a living thing with habits and tendencies, and a voice of its own if you knew how to hear it. Frank Castellano was the first person invited to participate. He said no at first. He said he was too old, too set in his ways, too out of touch with the new systems. They asked again. He said no again. Then Walsh drove up to Weaverville on a Saturday morning, sat down at Patsy's Diner across from Frank, ordered a cup of coffee he didn't want, and told him about a young specialist at his unit who'd been struggling with diagnostics on the T700 engine. The kid was smart, Walsh said, maybe the smartest mechanic he had, but something was missing. The kid could read every gauge and interpret every fault code, but when the gauges and the codes didn't tell the whole story, when the problem was in the space between what the machine reported and what the machine actually felt, the kid was lost. He needed someone to show him what lived in that space. Frank looked at Walsh for a long time. Then he picked up his coffee cup, took a slow sip, and said, "What's the kid's name?" The specialist's name was Marcus Jefferson. He was 23 years old, from Detroit, had joined the Army at 19 because college wasn't an option and factory work wasn't a future. He was whip smart, mechanically gifted, and had finished top of his class at the aviation maintenance course at Fort Eustis. He could troubleshoot a Blackhawk faster than anyone in his unit using the computerized diagnostic systems. But Walsh was right. When the computers couldn't explain what was wrong, when the problem was subtle or intermittent or buried in some interaction between systems that the diagnostics weren't designed to detect, Marcus hit a wall, and he knew it. It frustrated him in a way that kept him up at night, because he could sense that there was a deeper level of understanding out there, a way of knowing these machines that he hadn't reached yet, and he didn't know how to get there. The first time Marcus met Frank, he almost laughed. Not out of disrespect, but out of sheer surprise. He had been told that a retired veteran was coming to the unit to mentor the maintenance team, and he had expected someone with a briefcase and a set of slides. What he got was a thin old man in a flannel shirt and a faded ball cap who walked into the hangar, carrying a metal footlocker, set it down next to a Blackhawk and said, "Show me your hands." Marcus held out his hands. Frank looked at them the way a piano teacher looks at a new student's fingers. "Good hands," he said. "Strong, flexible. You play any instruments?" Marcus shook his head. "You will," Frank said. "After I'm done with you, you'll play these engines like a violin." Marcus didn't know what to make of that. But something in the old man's eyes, a steadiness, a depth, a quality of attention that Marcus had never seen in anyone before, told him to listen. Over the next 3 months, Frank came to the unit twice a week. He drove the hour and a half from Weaverville each time, arriving early in the morning and staying until mid-afternoon. He worked with the entire maintenance team, but it was clear from the start that he and Marcus had a particular connection. Frank saw in Marcus the same thing that had driven him 41 years earlier, a hunger not just to fix machines but to understand them, to know them in the way that a horseman knows a horse, not by what the manual says but by what the animal tells you when you're quiet enough to hear it. Frank started Marcus on what he called blind diagnostics. He would have Marcus close his eyes, put his hands on an engine and describe what he felt. Not what the gauges said, not what the technical order predicted, what the metal told his fingertips. At first, Marcus felt nothing, or rather he felt everything, heat, vibration, texture, but it was all noise, undifferentiated, meaningless. Frank was patient. "You're listening with your brain," he said. "Listen with your hands. Your brain wants to categorize and label. Your hands just want to feel. Let them." It took weeks, but slowly, incrementally, Marcus began to sense things, a slight unevenness in a vibration pattern that indicated a bearing approaching the end of its service life, a temperature differential across an engine housing that suggested an internal leak so small it wouldn't show up on any gauge for another 50 flight hours, a harmonic resonance in a tail rotor gearbox that told him a gear tooth had a microscopic crack that would become a catastrophic failure in another 200 hours of operation. He was learning to speak a language that had no words, a language that lived in the interface between human nerve endings and aircraft-grade aluminum, and Frank Castellano was the only translator he'd ever met. One afternoon, about 10 weeks into the mentorship, Frank and Marcus were working on a Blackhawk that had been flagged for a routine inspection, when Marcus stopped what he was doing, put both hands flat on the engine cowling, and stood very still. Frank watched him. He didn't say anything. After about 30 seconds, Marcus opened his eyes and said, "There's something wrong with the number 1 engine oil cooler. I think there's a partial blockage in one of the internal passages, right side, about 2/3 of the way back." Frank raised an eyebrow. They pulled the oil cooler and sent it to the shop for inspection. The shop found a partial blockage from a build-up of degraded O-ring material in an internal passage on the right side, approximately 2/3 of the way back. It was the kind of fault that could have led to an oil overheat condition in flight, the kind that could have meant an emergency landing at best and a crash at worst. Walsh got the report from the shop and sat staring at it for 5 full minutes. Then he walked out to the hangar where Frank and Marcus were cleaning tools side by side, the old man and the young man working in the comfortable silence of 2 people who understood each other without needing to fill the air with conversation. Walsh held up the report and said, "How?" Marcus looked at Frank. Frank looked at Marcus. Then Frank said, "I didn't teach him anything. I just showed him how to listen." Marcus shook his head. "That's not true," he said, turning to Walsh. "He taught me everything. He taught me that these machines aren't just systems and components. They're alive, in their way. They talk to you if you're willing to shut up long enough to hear them. Every vibration, every temperature, every sound, it's all information. And if you know how to read it, you can see problems coming months before they show up on any diagnostic screen. That's what he gave me. Not technique, not procedure, a way of thinking." Frank said nothing, but there was something in his expression, something soft and bright and deeply human that the men and women standing in that hangar recognized even if they couldn't name it. It was the face of a man who had spent a lifetime accumulating knowledge and skill that he feared would die with him, and who had just discovered that it wouldn't. The Legacy Maintenance Initiative expanded to 12 Army installations in its first year. Frank Castellano served as a mentor for 2 more years before his health finally made the long drives too difficult. Marcus Jefferson made Staff Sergeant, then was accepted to the Warrant Officer Candidate School, where he graduated at the top of his class and was assigned as a maintenance technician to an aviation unit at Fort Campbell. On his first day in his new assignment, the unit had a Blackhawk with an intermittent avionics fault that 3 different technicians had been unable to isolate. Marcus put his hands on the aircraft, closed his eyes, and found the fault in under 20 minutes. When the maintenance officer asked him how he did it, Marcus said, "A man named Frank Castellano taught me to listen." He kept a photograph in his toolbox of himself and Frank standing in front of a Blackhawk, both of them smiling, both of them with grease on their hands. On the back of the photograph in Frank's careful handwriting were 6 words. "The machine will always tell you." Colonel Engel, for her part, was promoted to Brigadier General and given command of an aviation brigade. In her promotion remarks, she told the story of the night she called a 78-year-old retired mechanic during a flood and watched him fix a helicopter that her entire maintenance team couldn't. "That night taught me something I should have known already," she said. "We spend so much time looking forward, chasing the newest technology and the latest systems and the most advanced diagnostics, that we forget to look behind us. We forget that the people who came before us didn't just build the foundation we're standing on, they built it with their hands, and those hands still have something to teach us. The day we stop listening to the people who came before us is the day we start making mistakes that cost lives." Frank Castellano passed away on a Sunday morning in April, 2 years after his last visit to the maintenance hangar. He died in his house in Weaverville, sitting in his chair on the back porch, with a cup of coffee beside him and his old leather notebook in his lap. The notebook was open to a page near the middle where he had written years ago a single sentence that might have been a prayer or a promise, or simply a statement of fact. It read, "Every machine has a heartbeat. Your job is to keep it beating." He was buried with full military honours at the National Cemetery in Asheville. The honour guard was provided by the aviation unit he had helped that night during the flood, and every mechanic in the unit volunteered to be part of it. Marcus Jefferson gave the eulogy. He stood in front of a gathering that included generals and privates, colonels and specialists, active duty and retired, old and young, and he said that Frank Castellano was the greatest teacher he had ever known, not because he had all the answers, but because he had all the questions. "He didn't teach me how to fix helicopters," Marcus said, his voice breaking only once. "He taught me how to hear them, and that is a gift I will carry for the rest of my life, and that I will pass on to every young mechanic who is willing to learn, because that's what Frank would have wanted. He didn't care about awards or recognition. He cared about the work. He cared about the machine. And most of all, he cared about the people the machine was supposed to protect. Every time a Blackhawk lifts off and goes to save someone's life, Frank Castellano is in that engine. He's in the vibration of every turbine blade, the flow of every drop of fuel, the beat of every rotor. He's in the hands of every mechanic who was lucky enough to learn from him, and he always will be." After the ceremony, the base commander unveiled a small plaque that had been mounted on the wall of the maintenance hangar, where Frank had spent his last years as a mentor. It read, "Dedicated to CW4 Frank Castellano, who listened when the machine spoke, and who taught others to listen. 14 lives saved, one legacy that will never end." Below the plaque, someone had placed Frank's old olive drab ball cap, the one with the tiny black helicopter embroidered on the side. It sat there on a small shelf, faded and worn, and if you didn't know what it represented, you'd walk right past it. But the people who knew, the mechanics and the crew chiefs and the pilots and the soldiers who owed their skills and maybe their lives to the quiet old man who used to wear it, they didn't walk past it. They stopped. They touched the brim, and they remembered. Some people carry their greatness on their chest, pinned to a uniform for the whole world to see. Some people carry it in their hands, in the calluses and the scars and the muscle memory of 10,000 hours of work that no one ever saw and no one ever applauded. Frank Castellano was the second kind of man. He never sought recognition. He never demanded respect. He never told anyone who he was or what he had done, because he believed that the work spoke for itself, and that a man who needed praise to feel valuable wasn't valuable at all. But on a rainy night in September, when a helicopter sat dead on a tarmac and people were drowning in the dark, his country called him one last time, and he answered the way he always had, quietly, without hesitation, with steady hands and a steady heart, and a lifetime of knowledge that no computer, no manual, and no amount of formal training could ever replace. He drove 3 hours through a storm to save people he would never meet, fixed a machine that an army of experts couldn't, and then drove home and made himself breakfast without telling a single soul. That is what service looks like. Not the parades and the medals and the thank you for your service handshakes that make us feel good about ourselves. The real service. the kind that happens at 4 in the morning on a rainy flight line when nobody's watching, and the only reward is knowing that the job got done and people are alive because of it. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that the people who built this country and defended it are still out here, living quietly among us with knowledge and skills and stories that we cannot afford to lose, then subscribe to this channel. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And the next time you see an old man in a worn-out cap sitting alone at a diner drinking his coffee, leaving a big tip, not saying much, maybe take a moment. Maybe say thank you. Not because he needs to hear it, but because you need to say it. Because Frank Castellano never needed anyone's respect to know his own worth. But the world is a better place when we give it anyway.